Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to the glory of God and his kingdom. We have a very full plate today, a lot of topics of concern, notably involving communist China. We're going to get to all of that with one of our featured regular guests in just a moment. But before we do, let me talk a little bit with you about some context for one of the particularly, enervating pursuit of AI is required to compete with communist China, or will be permanently dominated militarily and economically. Some experts are warning, however, that by allowing China to buy AI-useful NVIDIA H20 chips and then profit from the sales, the Trump administration will help it beat us. While others contend those chips are widely available and will stay ahead by selling them, we seem to be facing a lose-lose proposition, facilitating Chinese AI dominance, even as we pursue technologies that may make us more like communist China, appears to be a formula for Frank and I at their hands or ours. Those are my thoughts. For more of them, follow me at Frank Gaffney on X, also at securingamerica.substack.com. We also are proud to be part of the usfuture.org Institute for the American Future. I hope you'll check us out there as well. Let's turn for some comments of his own on AI to a man who we are very, very proud to have be one of his, I said, a featured guest here at Securing America. His name is Bill Walton. He is the host of his own television program, as well as a man with great experience on Wall Street, having run Allied Capital there, and now serving as the vice chairman of the Conservative Political Action Coalition. A man of great experience, and we're anxious to get his thoughts on AI, among other things. Welcome back, Bill. Good to have you with us, sir.
Frank, great talking with you.
So, Bill, I know you are an aficionado of AI and are watching closely as both an investor as well as a consumer what is developing in the industry. Do you share concerns about the possibility that this may become a monster if we're not careful?
Well, the answer to that is yes. But then the longer answer is it depends on how you mitigate the risk. And I'm one of these people that sits with my computer open to 5 different AI apps at the same time, sort of curating which ones I want to use for which question or which project, and they are very different from each other. AI artificial intelligence is going to morph into something, I guess the term is artificial general intelligence. And these models were all created with as large language models, which means they went out to the world, the universe, and scoured it for every single written thing ever, anywhere. And consequently, they built up the database of purportedly all of human knowledge. Now, the interesting part of that is some of that knowledge is smarter than others, which is one of the reasons the models have glitches. But then the next question is, now that AI is no longer waiting for people to program it, AI is programming itself. And you basically put in algorithms and it comes up with a new iteration of this, that, and the other. And they're building this 24/7 as we speak. And you have probably 10,000 Mensa members working on this and multiplying its capabilities, week after week. ChatGPT just rolled out its model 5.0 last week, which is pronounced the most sophisticated and best ever, and yet this week people are complaining about it, that it doesn't do what the old models used to do. So, but where this turns into Franken AI is when it programs itself and we no longer understand what it's programmed. And the other thing is the limits now are human knowledge. What if they go beyond human knowledge? What if they go beyond human IQ? And it's likely it will. I mean, I'd say it's highly likely. And then what do we have?
Well, there is the pregnant question. And again, as both a avid consumer, as you say, but also investor, do you think that there's really any way to avoid that trajectory running its course, that this advanced general intelligence is going, in fact, to become smarter than we are, and we will not be able either to understand fully what it's doing, let alone control it?
I don't think it will be stopped. I don't think there's a appetite here in this country or in China, and really the whole game is being played in those two countries. I don't think there's any appetite to stop it. The White House just came out with an AI action plan last week, which embraces it and embraces the building out of data centers and creating the energy, the electricity that we're going to need to power these. I mean, they're massive consumers of electricity. You know, some of them as much as a small city, but we're full under the Trump administration. We're full speed ahead, and we've got a lot of ethicists. A lot of us are concerned about, where this may be going. Obviously we're concerned about the bias in the models, and that they've got political content, and the people that program them or train them. I guess that's the word that's used. A lot of bias. A lot of people from San Francisco who have got a very radical left agenda. So you find some of that in there, and I think the self-governing piece, though, is everybody notices it, and I've found that if you get an answer that's one thing, you can ask for something else and get a different perspective. But we're going to have to learn how to unplug these in case something does occur where we've got, and I know there's a movie that I haven't watched where the computer takes over. I date all the way back to HAL.
Yeah, well, that's mine too.
There's another one, I think, in the Terminator movie. Yeah, it's the Terminator movie that it takes over. And that's we're in a brave new world, Frank, and it's hard to say with certainty that we'll tame this thing, but it's happening.
Well, you have unfortunately reinforced most of my concerns, and Bill, I appreciate that.
It's the way it is.
Some of us are alive to the fact that the bias is apparent. I'm hearing that even Google is now somewhat upset that its search engine is being essentially replaced by the AI rendering of whatever it is you're searching for that is at the top of the page now, and that's an interesting example of, I guess, what's coming is that we will find even the tech giants being eaten up by their creation.
Except that Google now has its own AI called Gemini. Which is quite good.
Well, I think it's Gemini that's on the top of their page, but I'm just saying that the rest of it.
Well, no, but let me continue, Frank.
Please.
The thing about search is that you come up and it gives you a list of websites, and we all know if the Google page would show you 30 pages of websites, and all of them are the New York Times and the Washington Post and NPR, and you've got to search in vain for information that would reflect our point of view. Well, the search, the AI changes that, I believe, in a way that's very helpful. You can ask it a question, and it'll come back maybe with a left-wing answer, or in my case, an economic answer that resembles something written by Karl Marx. But you can then turn to it and say, "Look, you don't give me this type economics. I want to see Austrian economics or Milton Friedman economics." And surprisingly, at least when I first started using this, it'll come back with a better answer. And so you can prompt these.
Challenging the AI is the.
And I argue with them all day long.
Well, this is what we're all going to find ourselves doing. I hope we're maybe unplugging. Bill, we'll be right back with more. Stay tuned for more with Bill Walton right after this.
Yeah.
We're back, and so is Bill Walton, praise the Lord. Bill is, of course, as I'm sure all of you are aware, the host of a terrific television show of his own, and we are so grateful to him for dropping by here, usually once a week about now, and giving us an update, often on something that he has become very, very steeped in, which is the state of developments in China. And we talked a little bit about them in connection with AI in our previous conversation. But, Bill, you had some news headlines that I thought would be interesting for our audience to hear about. You have been talking about direct investment in China drying up for some time. We've been anxious to see that happen, especially investment by unwitting American investors, thanks to your former colleagues on Wall Street sending our money that way. Give us an update on what's happening, and is this likely good news for those American investors?
Well, it's a very interesting direction this is going. China has become an excruciating place to do business, both for outside investors, so-called foreign investors in China, but also Chinese themselves. And the regulatory environment is such that you really, as an American trying to invest in China, you'd be crazy to do it, because even the consulting firms, which used to tell you what companies were good and what companies were bad, they've been put out of business by regulations from the Communist Party there. And then the Chinese entrepreneurs. He's really President Xi's really cracked down on the tech industry, and he shut the entire private tutoring industry down a couple of years ago, and virtually everything they do is monitored, and as a telling signal of that, there have been 4 entrepreneurs, very, very in previous years successful wealthy men who have hurled themselves out of buildings, and we've got 4 suicides in the last 7 or 8 months, and all in different industries. So it's not just one industry that's being affected. So Xi...
Is there any suspicion that they're being thrown out of buildings, suicide dead, as opposed to committing suicide, Bill? Or do you think it's...
In China, anything is possible, Frank.
Yes,
but
it is.
Usually they're more subtle than that.
Yeah.
You just... In China, you usually just disappear.
Yeah. Well, we featured in our webinar of our Committee on the Present Danger of China, of which you are, of course, a very important member, last week, a movie entitled The Unrestricted War.
Yeah.
Which was basically focused on the experiences of a Western Canadian investor in China, an entrepreneur there, biotech in this case. And there were people being suicided in that film, and certainly mass horrors in terms of what the Chinese were doing to their own people in the midst of the COVID crisis.
Well,
it is a place where that happens.
Throw them out the window, because they've got better ways to do it that's not as public and doesn't show how much the regime is hated. And we talked about the foreign direct investment. I want to point out that outside money coming into China, investment dollars, have fallen 99% in the last 3 years, and it's almost at zero. I think it was like 14 billion in an economy the size of China's. That is a drop in the ocean. By contrast, we've got Donald Trump hoovering up billions of dollars in commitments from, it seems like every country in the world. If you don't want to suffer his 140% tariffs, has got to pony up the billions. I think China's at
America's hot.
50 billion.
Partly because he's turning up the heat. Let me just ask you, speaking of foreign investment, one of the places where I think we have a little bit of a disagreement is that the Chinese have been successful with the help of Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan and Brian Moynihan at Bank of America, and creating a kind of Hong Kong backdoor, notably by floating an IPO for a company called Cattle, that is a Chinese military company, according to the Pentagon. There are, I'm told, now some 13 other IPOs that are lined up to do the same. Bill, does the data about direct investment in China reflect what they're getting through this sort of cutout in Hong Kong?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. But I do know anecdotally the venture capital business has shut down in China. A lot of everybody had 5 years ago, everybody had a China desk and was very, very active, and they had shops in Beijing and all over the country, and they were investing billions of dollars. That's not happening. And so the venture capital money, the private equity money, is not going in. Now the Cattle is a public offering, and part of the underwriting was with J.P. Morgan and Bank of America. Now, but the question, Frank, is if you go into one of these offices, it doesn't look like America. These are all Chinese investment bankers who happen to be employed by J.P. Morgan and B of A. The question is, how many American investors participated in this offering? And I don't know the answer to that, but that would be something we'd be very concerned about. I think it was
principally institutional investors, Bill. I don't know that individuals were involved much.
Well, probably not. Well, institutions are based here in the States, but then most of the big institutions have investors from all over the world. We'd need to analyze it, but I know that one of the congressmen has sent a chilling letter to Jamie and to Brian, and it's something we want to look at. Yeah, and so it's. No, we should not be underwriting public companies in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, which used to be notably independent of the Chinese Communist Party, in the last 5 years, it's indistinguishable. I mean, there are no freedoms in Hong Kong. They've just another Chinese city.
Bill, let me ask you a related issue, I think, is that the Chinese have adopted even more aggressive statutes in their parliament, if you will, Congress, to insist that intellectual property that foreigners are bringing to China is Chinese, words to that effect. Is that right? And that must be a further chilling consideration, is it not?
Well, we used to complain that the Chinese stole intellectual property. So what did the Chinese do? They passed a law making it legal to take intellectual property. And it's not just intellectual property. It's right down to the cash that companies could be holding in China. And of course, there's no recourse. There's no judicial system that matters in China. It's only an artifice. So if you do have property taken, there's no court of appeal to go to. It's just gone. That's another reason why foreign direct investment has fallen so much. But they made it legal, Frank, and that's it's hard to overstate what an implacable Marxist communist this guy really is. I mean, he hates the private sector. He hates the entrepreneurship. He hates anything that he doesn't control completely or the party controls completely. He's a bad guy, and
seriously bad guy. So, Bill, where do you come down on the sweepstakes about whether he's now at the end of his run? That
a lot of rumors.
Situations, now essentially a matter of time before he's gone.
Well, he hasn't shown up at a lot of key meetings, and he didn't show up at the BRIC meeting a couple of weeks ago, where normally he'd be there. But there are two explanations. One, he's being forced out. The other one is he's 70 years old and is a heavy smoker. And I don't know. I think he's 70. He could be 69 or 71. He's in that age range. And so he's not, and he hasn't been healthy. So whether it's, but what happens to fierce leaders like this is once they start losing their health, they start losing their capacity to hold power. and it gives openings to lots of people around him, and you've got to believe that people would, any number of people would like his job.
We'll be watching the sweepstakes carefully with your help, my friend. Thank you so much for joining us. Bill Walton, as always, it's great to be with you, and I look forward to our next visit next week.
Interesting world.
We'll be right back, folks. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and I can't tell you how excited I am for our next conversation. It is going to be with Twyla Brace, a registered nurse by training, who I have been chasing around, and she chasing me now for many months, it seems, to try to get her on to talk about a passion that we share, which is concerns about the program known as Real ID. Twyla is the co-founder and president of a remarkable organization, Citizens Concerned. What have I got here? I can't read my handwriting.
Citizens Council.
Citizens Council. The co-founder and president of Citizens Council for Health Freedom, and it is as part of the work that she's about in the health freedom space, notably the subject of an important book she wrote, Big Brother in the Exam Room, The Dangerous Truth About Electronic Health Records. And that brings her to this topic. And we're going to visit with her about why, if you are concerned, as many of us, particularly in the Sovereignty Coalition, of which she is an important member, have been about digital gulags that seem to be headed our way, this is a particular source of concern, Real IDs. So Twyla, welcome. It's so good to have you here, and thank you for bearing with us as we've chased. But tell us a little bit about what the Real ID is, for starters.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that the Real ID is often not what people think it is. It is a federal identification card for a national surveillance system. The Real ID is not just a card, it is a system. The DMVs plan to put it on your phone, digitize it, put it
But
on
let me
your
ask you about that, if I may, because the DMVs, of course, work for the states, and
Correct.
they're the institutions that are issuing these IDs, and yet you're saying that it's not a state thing, it's a national ID, effectively?
Yes. So the DMVs have been hijacked. The state driver's license and state IDs have been hijacked for the purpose of imposing Real ID. So most people think that what they have is a state driver's license that just got a star added, but it's not. The state driver's license that has become a Real ID now, and you'll notice it's not a federal driver's license. It's not a real driver's license, right? It's a Real ID. So this is an identification card, a federal identification card. The star is required as part of the federal requirements. A biometric photo is required as part of the federal requirements, and this is for facial recognition systems. That did not used to be the case. There was, just like regular photos before the Real ID system. And so the other thing to understand.
And what is the distinction between a biomedical photograph and a regular photograph?
A biometric. It's really, the state has said that they have a right to collect and catalog the coordinates of your body for their control. So this is capturing the geometry of your face. But the Real ID rule says they don't have to stop with facial recognition technology. They can also require other biometrics in the future, like your thumbprint, your palm print, your iris scan, all of these meant to make your body your ID. And the government is using, for creation of these, is using IDEMIA, a company in France. And IDEMIA's plan is augmented authentication, which means you'll never have to carry a paper anywhere. It'll all be your body, your face, your eyes, your thumbprint, your palm. You just
some chip that's been placed in you, no doubt, at due course.
And
right?
that certainly could be it, because as you know, there are countries who are already using chips for payment and for identification. They don't talk about the chip. They don't talk about that, but they do talk about digitizing. And so you'll see these laws around the country popping up for digital ID, permitting digital ID. Well, everybody should not agree to that, because every time you use it, you ping the DMV, you ping the government. And of course, when the states have complied with the federal government and conformed state law and said, we will do what the federal government wants, so they've been commandeered by the federal government, right, against the 10th Amendment. Then the states have agreed to do whatever the federal government decides to do in the future, like share all the data, like add the biometrics. So all of this is a system that is meant for far more than flight. That's the other thing, is that the law itself...
Flight meaning used to get on airplanes.
Commercial airlines, yeah.
Which is now mandatory.
Yeah. So the law says...
exceptions.
Yeah. The law says the Real ID is for three purposes: access to federal facilities, access to nuclear facilities, and access to commercial flight, and any other purposes that the Secretary of Homeland Security shall determine. Which is why, as a health freedom organization, we believe it will be no card, no care. That they will decide that the next thing that they need is access to medical care as a requirement for the Real ID. I think there'd be two reasons for that. One is because everybody doesn't have to fly, but everybody needs a doctor. So that would be the way to get the American public compliant. And there are 44% of cards that are not compliant today. But the other...
By cards, you mean IDs?
IDs
driver's
and
licenses? Mm-hmm.
That's correct. And so our organization is really trying to change that trajectory around. So we're asking people to go to our special website, refuserealid.org, and there are instructions as to how you can turn in your Real ID and ask for a state driver's license, because 45 states do not require you to have a Real ID by law. There are 5 Republican states that do, and they don't even give you an option. But all the other states, by law, do not require a real ID. And so people should turn in their real ID, their STAR card, if they have one, and get a state driver's license or a state ID rather than the federal real ID, and that will thwart their plans of creating this massive digital system, that will connect all sorts of information, including your health information, all through this digital ID.
So you'll have to use, for example, a passport to fly, but how do you prevent the trajectory that you're talking about here of next requiring you to have a card with a star to get health care?
Yes. So we have 3 things that we're working on, 3 angles where we're working on. One is just to get the public informed and engaged. They have to start turning back in their real IDs and getting state driver's licenses. Then we are also engaging with state legislators. So there are 10 states that currently have state legislators in them that have already introduced legislation to repeal their conformity with the Federal Real ID Act, or they have other resolutions opposing Real ID. And then the last thing is that we're working with the state AGs. We've had a meeting with state AGs and said, it's your job to support federalism, which means that the federal government cannot commandeer the state under the 10th Amendment. And so we're asking them to act, and we will see where that goes.
Well, this is really important work that you're about, Twyla, and I commend you for it. And thank you especially for looking over the horizon at where this goes next, because if you would put this in the context we've been talking about throughout the program of artificial intelligence being used to exercise more and more and more control over us, presumably the digitization of all of our data, health data included, will greatly accelerate that process, will it not? And also that we're going to find ourselves increasingly, it seems, confronting the kind of challenges that we saw in COVID, where you were basically forced to behave in certain ways as a result of this kind of control. No?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things moving in the direction of digital control of the entire population, from Palantir and their plan to collect all this data from every source possible and pull it together, and then Real ID being digitized, and the Real ID could become the Vax passport, that if we had that during COVID times, all sorts of people would not have been allowed to do all sorts of things. If the government...
This is the social credit system of China,
That's exactly
effectively,
right.
Where
That
they
is
start
exactly right.
constricting your access to your bank account and movement even in local, transportation systems and the like. Is that right?
Yes, and when I think of who the next president could be or the next administration could be, if it wasn't on the conservative side and it was on the progressive Marxist socialist side, right? They want you in your 15-minute city, right? They want to create 15-minute cities and keep you there. And they would know whenever you left if you had a digital ID and it was on your phone. Wherever you went, you'd be telling them where you went.
So talk about that. If you're no longer talking about a card now, you're talking about that information being resident on your phone.
Correct.
And that means it's accessible to people even if you're not communicating that information with them?
That's correct. And when we did our report on IDEMIA probably 6 years ago, New Jersey, I think it was New Jersey, that was already doing a digital ID experiment with state employees. And one of the things that they said was that the police could come right up next to a car without even stopping it, and they could know who the driver was. Well, then, of course, they would also know who the other individuals in the car were, right? Because if it's all digitized and they can have access it through Bluetooth or whatever, then they will know. So this is where the country is moving, and this is where we, as people who love freedom, can't allow the country to go.
Amen. And Refuse Real ID is a place where people can take action.
RefuseRealID.org.
RefuseRealID.org.
Yep.
a place I commend to all of you. Twyla, you need to come back. This is a very important first conversation, but obviously there's an awful lot more that has to be explored here. So I hope
Happy to
have an easier time of catching up with you next time. But thank you for this very important conversation. God bless you and your important work. RefuseRealID.org. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back, and a very special welcome to the man who is the chairman of the board of our Institute for the American Future. His name is Rod Martin. That is only one of his distinctions. He is the author of the Rod Martin Report, a wonderful online resource available to you at rodmartin.org. He was one of the PayPal mafia back when men were men. He has gone on to be a successful entrepreneur and capitalist, but he is prized by me and I think our audience because of his free-range mind. Really one of the great intellects of our time, public intellectual and all that. And we're delighted to have him always. Welcome back, Rod. Good to have you with us as ever. So I want to catch up with you on a couple of things. We've been talking in the course of the program about artificial intelligence. And I confess to being something of a Luddite about all of this, meaning not so keen on these kinds of technological possible monsters. I know you are a tech entrepreneur by avocation and training. Make us feel a little bit better about this possibility that we might see Franken AI emerging from sort of unchecked, unregulated competition with China.
Well, acknowledging all of the issues, I too have seen Terminator. I encourage everybody to watch The Matrix. There are clearly problems attendant to this. But one of them so far is not actual intelligence. Artificial, yes. Intelligent, no. And if you just experience the GPT-5 rollout, you know what I'm talking about. It's got basically the same limitations that 4.0 had a month ago. And that's frankly very frustrating. We were promised all this advance, and no, because they're hitting a limit. The reality is, as George Gilder has said unendingly, computation is not comprehension. And there is a very serious new pagan religion in Silicon Valley built around creating an artificial superintelligence that we're basically all going to obey and worship. And it's just not happening. Now, might it happen in the far future? Maybe. Might it happen in the mid-future? Probably not, but I guess it could. There's nothing they're doing right now that doesn't just enhance productivity with no possibility of taking over or anything like that.
Well, that's very heartening, I dare say. And part of this is a question of, I guess, whether computational ability of a prodigious character could get you into self-learning, which gets you into possible, well, outpacing the comprehension, to use George Gilder's word, of man as to what these things are up to. If that translates into a measure of control over, the things that make our lives work, is that not possibly the kind of Terminator complex that some of us think is fiction, some of us are worried about might become our future?
Well, the real danger lies in applications. I really don't think you get to an actual intelligence. You certainly aren't going to with GPT-5 or 6 or Grok 4 for that matter. Grok 10, I don't see how from here. But at the same time, are these fears legitimate? Well, there was a video game about 20 years ago that examined this exact thing. It was an entire series of games called the X Games, ironically enough. And the idea was that these really powerful machines humanity had launched into space to terraform planets got their coding corrupted. And so all of a sudden they see humanity as a target rather than the purpose of their work, and it's not possible to turn them off. So it becomes this huge war, which makes a great video game, by the way, but it's also a great threat. You could absolutely see some pretty terrible things happen if we're going to have AI-powered autonomous drones in combat, or lots of other things controlling those drones or controlling other aspects of life. So the problem, as is the case with advancing technology in all cases, all throughout our history, is that you have to control it legislatively. You have to enforce America's constitutional civil rights vigorously and in a way that, okay, there will always be technological workarounds. There will always be people who cheat, but you punish them when they do, which, by the way, is the most exciting thing we're seeing out of the Trump administration now that Vance is saying there are going to be tons of indictments over Russiagate. If you just chop the heads off the people who do wrong, the next group of people doesn't do as much wrong. And that's what we have to do. We have to be an engaged citizen body, refusing to knuckle under to just whatsoever comes. And I think
that's really the heart of the matter here, Rod, as I see it. I mean, we had recently in the United States Senate, as you know, actually starting in the House, legislation that said, for 10 years, no state will be able to impose any kind of regulation on AI. And I get the argument, well, you don't want 50 states doing this piecemeal. That's pretty crazy. But the idea that nobody will do it because the federal government is clearly not interested in doing any kind of regulation on AI. And, the way it played out in the end, as you know, I'm sure, was the measure that was introduced into the House version of the One Big Beautiful Bill that said keep your hands off this, states for 10 years, was ultimately upended 99-1 in the United States Senate. So I think if you can keep up with this, I mean, the legislative process on a good day is, shall we say, rather constipated, to put it mildly. But if it could be possible, some sort of mechanism needs to be done, whether it's legislation or oversight or other kinds of regulation. And that's where it seems as though we're falling down. And I need to take a short break. And when we come back, I'll ask you to just comment on that if you can quickly. And then I want to turn to another very important topic you've addressed recently. Stay tuned for much more with the great free-range mind of Rod Martin. Follow him as well at rodmartin.org. Be right back. Welcome back. We're talking with one of our great friends and colleagues, Rod Martin, about artificial intelligence, continuing a conversation we've had throughout the program. He's rather more sanguine about the possibility that all will be well, that Franken AI could happen, but isn't going to, in part perhaps because we're going to regulate it in such a way as to prevent that. So, Rod, I've expressed concerns about doing that mechanically. Can you allay those as well?
Well, to be fair, I'm not sure that we will regulate it properly, as evidenced by the Pentagon's obsession with drone wingmen and all kinds of semi-autonomous weapon systems. That's actually extremely concerning. That is Terminator, for heaven's sake. So why would we want to do that? I understand why we want to do that. And there's some...
Well, to compete with China is why we're told we must do that.
Well, of course. And the Chinese have no qualms about it at all. If they could build you a clone army like in the second Star Wars prequel, they'd do it tomorrow. So, that doesn't mean we have to match them, but it does mean we have to figure out what they're doing, how they're doing it, ways to counter it. So you've got all these cross currents. But at the end of the day, my point is just we have to be vigilant. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And as technology becomes more and more powerful, we're going to have a smaller government that enforces civil rights more more seriously, more draconianly in some cases. There just have to be some lines you can't cross. And we haven't figured out what they all are yet. But it isn't that hard, because we've been talking about this in science fiction for 80 or 90 years.
Well, figuring out the lines seems to be the lesser of the problems. Figuring out how to impose those lines and enforce them is going to be the challenge. It may be, I mean, we're talking about AI reducing the workforce. It may be that you can get a smaller government with AI, but whether it's a bigger brother is the bigger concern.
Trump has deployed an AI tool at Doge that is targeting 50% of all federal regulations to be eliminated by the end of 2025. Not 10 years like everything in Washington seems to be, which means never, but literally this year. And will they achieve that? I don't know, probably not, but they're trying. And that's really encouraging. And if you get rid of the deadwood, there's an incredible opportunity for a leaner, meaner government that is actually responsive to the elective branches. That's all you can ask for.
Yeah. And I guess what you're saying is that if you get that smaller government and it is focused on regulation that matters, maybe they'll be able to regulate artificial intelligence in a way that prevents Franken AI. Speaking of Franken, there are those, Rod Martin, who believe that the advent of the atomic age towards the end of World War II that completed that war with the dropping of 2 bombs, the anniversaries of which were recognized last week, one in Hiroshima and the other in Nagasaki, prompting some, as ever, to complain bitterly that was done. You wrote a very interesting piece at your platform, rodmartin.org, about this as a justified action. Would you walk us through why it was so, in your estimation?
Well, you know, for me to ever say Truman is right is really kind of hard for me. But nevertheless, the title of the piece is Truman Was Right. And he was. He absolutely was. Look, bottom line is we didn't start the war. So the folks on the right who want to talk about just war theory need to start there. They tend to want to isolate Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the context in which it existed, which is just absurd. We're fighting a defensive war against actually the most brutal, the most savage enemy we faced in World War II. There were days they made Hitler blush, by comparison. Just look at their attack on the Chinese capital, which at the time was Nanking, in which they worked in hand to hand, raping and murdering their way to the center like Genghis Khan. 300,000 dead hand to hand. We killed half that many at Nagasaki and Hiroshima put together. So you say, well, okay, that still doesn't justify it. Well, but it does, because those 2 cities were key military targets. Hiroshima in particular was a prime military target, but Nagasaki was the most important port in the southern island, which we were about to invade. And there's this ongoing argument about, well, we could have just blockaded them and starved them out. Think about what you're saying. The army wasn't going to starve. The elderly and the children and the women were going to starve. You're proposing a blockade as a more humanitarian way to go forward, when in reality, it is the least humanitarian way possible. What the bomb did was it shook Tokyo out of its inertia, and it forced them to make peace. After Nagasaki, on the 9th, the Japanese decided to surrender on the 10th. So, the claims that, it was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria or whatever. No, it wasn't. It was Nagasaki means they've got more bombs, which actually wasn't true, but they didn't know it. And it put them in a position to rethink core presuppositions, and we got to a peace. And Japan's an infinitely better country because of that.
And Rod, I think it's also important to note that it wasn't just that it brought about the end of the war. It was on our terms. It was unconditional surrender. And that gave rise to the kind of Japan that we have today. And this is one of the things that I'm so frustrated about practically every war we've fought since, which is unconditional surrender is not part of the deal. The decisive victory that we accomplished with those 2 bombs, sparing, by the way, as you note in your piece, God only knows how many millions of Japanese and American soldiers from certain death. But we also, I think, have to recognize that they created those conditions, and we are desperately in need of decisive victories over today's enemies, including, notably, I personally believe, the Sharia supremacists of Iran.
No, and the other thing
other
thing that Truman got right, of course, was containment. And I think Trump is doing a good job of containing China at the moment, certainly a lot better than his predecessor. But yes.
You have to leave it at that, my friend. We are hard out of time. Thank you for joining us. Come back soon. I hope the rest of you will do the same next time. Until then, go forth and multiply.
back to this Real America's Voice news break. I'm Terrence Bates. So many people live with discomfort every single day. We're talking things like heartburn, allergies, bloating, digestive issues. Many just assume that the discomfort is part of normal everyday life. But my next guest says, think again. Others have even tried his intracellular hydration protocol, and they found a new lease on life.
Saw the 555 and we, kept asking, like, I'm just doing it. I'm going to check it out and see what it is. And I'm like, okay, it just resonated. I'm like, had to do it. I went to him. I'm like, all right, honey, I really want to do this. You joining me or not? And here we are. So
couldn't be happier. It's been the best thing for both of us. It's awesome.
Well, John Jubilee is behind all of that joy you just heard. John, always good to see you.
Great to see you, Terrence.
So look, you teach intracellular hydration, and that's basically the missing link to restoring balance in our gut, our immune system, and even hormones. Break all of that down for us.
No, I love to, Terrence. I love to make it simple for people. Just think about, God made the earth mostly water. He made us as people. We're supposed to be mostly water. But through life and stress and oxidative stress, we just basically we basically dehydrate over time. And think about the difference simply, what is a raisin? What's the difference between a raisin and a grape? It's simply dehydration. A dehydrated grape is a raisin. So think of yourself as a human. Think of your brain, your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, your thyroid, your pancreas, all your organs as they slowly dehydrate. Of course, they're not optimized anymore. So, look at the difference between a fresh, healthy teenager, and then, somebody in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, they just look like they dehydrated because they did. And so, Terrence, the great joy for all of us that I've learned through this patent pending science we can rehydrate. We can reverse age ourselves. And you know what? It's amazing, Terrence. There's even a scripture in the Bible. It talks about our youth and strength being renewed like an eagle. So there is a renewal process, even in nature, that